Greetings and welcome to the Saroth the Magick Experiment. Tonight I have a third time returning guest, one of my favourite psychonauts and magicians of all time, Mr. Julian Vayne.
Steve, thank you so much for inviting me back again. Really appreciate it. Lovely to be speaking with you, my friend.
Well, you've always got interesting things to say. So we were going to be doing, I saw you were doing it. You do so many things. I always think hardest working magician in showbiz. Because I just watched you on Anthony Peak like half an hour ago. That was live, was it?
It was live. Today is the day of interviews, it would seem. So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of putting a few things into the calendar now because lots of October I'm going to be away leading a retreat in Guatemala. So anything that needs doing now before I'm out of the country for a few weeks.
Just your average retreat in Guatemala.
Like you do. Yeah. I've been working with these guys, the Fungi Academy, who've got a place there near Lake Atitlan, which is the sort of the Mayan sacred lake. I've been working with them for a few years. They invited me to do a psychedelic journey work course, like an online thing. And we produced this beautiful film, and all the materials associated with it and so on. And then we thought it would be a wizard wheeze to actually get a community of practice together to explore the kind of the emerging psychedelic field, how and particularly in relation to sort of ceremony. And that's what I know I kind of suggested one of the topics maybe to touch on today, which was the relationship between magic and particularly the Western magical tradition, for want of better terms, and so on, and the psychedelic renaissance. So the kind of the rebooted field of using psychedelics, and kind of what's the connection between those things. So that's one of the areas that we're going to be exploring in Guatemala in October.
Fantastic. So tell me, psychedelics have gone from a very sort of underground, deeply illegal thing to, people on spring break and stuff are going to take ayahuasca and stuff. So, I mean, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, Julian?
Well, mate, I think the world is more complicated than whether things are good things or bad things by and large.
Yeah.
To every complex problem.
I'm being dualist.
I know. To every complex problem, there's a simple solution. It's generally wrong. But I would say that the fact that there's this kind of renewed engagement with psychedelics. I mean, I've been recently, over the course of the last couple of days, I kind of figured that I should go and watch the Netflix How to Change Your Mind
it's not that one.
documentaries. Yeah, really good, really interesting. And obviously kind of big news, Michael Pollan's book, all of that kind of stuff. And we're seeing in places like the United States in particular, but by no means limited to that nation, the return of psychedelic psychotherapy, psychedelic ceremony.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I mean, is going to Iquitos to go, or Mapia or wherever, to go and take your ayahuasca a good thing or a bad thing? I suppose one thing I'm always kind of conscious of is if you look at the story of Maria Sabina, this very generous Mazatec curandera healer lady.
The name rings a bell for sure,
Yeah. So she's basically, I mean, it's it's in the documentaries and whatever, but she was the person who in the 1950s allowed Gordon and Valentina Wassam, these two European mothers, to come into the ceremony. So the interesting thing about that is that it was a really amazing opportunity for a story that then reconnected the Western world with its psychedelic heritage, including us realizing that the medicine grew here all over in profusion.
Oh wow, yeah.
In some places anyway. But Maria Sabina had a really hard time of it. Like the Beatles turned up, the Rolling Stones turned up, a whole bunch of people turned up at this woman's village. So I guess the thing is that we just have to be thoughtful when if we're going to blat over to somebody else's culture, take their sacred medicine. There will be all of the above. There's going to be like really good parts of that experience, really difficult parts of that experience. There will be effects that we'll be having culturally. Just have to be really kind of mindful about the way in which these things unfold, particularly given the fact that DMT, the active principle in ayahuasca, is really only an oxygen and hydrogen molecule different from psilocybin. And psilocybin
it's everywhere.
Is everywhere, exactly.
So how do you see magic and psych? For me, they're inextricably linked because I took mushrooms at like 14 and saw what I thought might be the astral plane because I was reading David Conway's primer, occult primer at the time, and he had a huge chapter on the astral plane, and it's like this is obviously it. And it's continued 35 years. I had a ceremony a few nights ago. And it is, because I think in magical terms, it frames your trip, set and setting in a very magical thing. And but not everyone is wired like that. Some people will get, do you think psychedelics created religion or and magic and all that? I kind of do.
I mean, I think certainly it's true that, and I think it's pretty much historically supportable that psychoactive and particularly psychedelic substances lie at the root of lots of religious belief. I think that we know from archaeology, from history, from intertextual analysis, from stuff like the immortality key, blah blah blah. There are loads and loads of sources that we know that these things have played a very important role in the development of religiosity. I mean, one thing that I think was always quite interesting is that you get all those people in, say, 1960s America in particular, taking LSD with things like, Ken Kesey's acid tests and Grateful Dead and that sort of stuff. And one thing that happens to those people is they suddenly become turned on, certainly interested in things like Eastern spiritualities.
Yeah.
So one of the things that psychedelics often invite us to do is to go, well, that was really weird, whatever the experience was. How can I explore that further, perhaps without necessarily having to take the drugs every weekend? Like, are there other techniques? Oh, turns out there's a whole repertoire of them.
Yeah.
Some of which are embedded within religion, some of which are a bit more kind of left field esoteric. But yeah, I mean, I think they invite us to explore spirituality in its broadest kind of sense.
Absolutely.
So there's definitely a relationship there. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and the Bible, the Holy of Holies, apparently had all these hallucinogenic and cannabis. I believe they had another name for it. And even in the grimoires, a lot of the materials seem to be vaguely or overtly psychedelic, or at least psychoactive.
It's definitely the case. I mean, one of the go-to authors for the Old Testament stuff is a guy called Danny Nemu, Nemu. So he's written and spoken quite a lot about this and done various experiments and so on. The short answer is that the Ark of the Covenant was held within what is essentially a hotbox environment for taking vast quantities of, frankincense, cannabis, and so on. So yes, these were religious rituals where mind-altering substances were very much kind of key to the way that those processes unfolded. We know from recent archaeological evidence that there's, I think, a temple that was found with altar to essentially Yahweh and Asherah, Yahweh's female partner or component. And one of the materials found as an incense was cannabis. There's certainly a great relationship between cannabis and the Western magical tradition. Again, the go-to book is Liber 420 by Chris Bennett. An amazing.
I've meant to get that for ages. I've never.
It's really good, and it's really good. I mean, it's primarily about cannabis, but it does touch on other substances as well. And as you say, the thing about the grimoires is that everyone gets kind of fascinated by the lists of spirits and their weird seals and the strange invocations and so on. But the critical ingredient is often, look at the incense list. Look at what's actually
exactly.
in there. Like, you burn that stuff, you're going to see stuff. I mean, it's like, henbane is a powerful material. And if you mix that with cannabis, with these other substances, you've got quite a very dicey, from a kind of pharmacological point of view, material. But yeah, I mean, it's going to make that evocation to visible appearance absolutely possible.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can't imagine evocation to visible appearance without some kind of psychedelic. I recently did DMT for the well, I had a wee dabble, but seriously for the first time, because I've got enough. And it was very interesting. I didn't get the breakthrough. I think I'd need a friend to help. But the DMT, I'm kind of sick of hearing about the DMT space. But whatever that dimension, I mean, it's the same on high dose mushrooms. Seems to be much the same place. Gyrating geometry, entities, definitely entities. Are these entities the same ones that are Hathor, Freya, Odin? I got a feeling they are, somehow.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that what happens, I mean, there's so many ways of looking at this, and I think that, I mean, I'm always interested in, like, what's the experience, what's the encounter, what is revealed in that encounter, or what changes as a result of the encounter, and the sort of the ontological reality or otherwise of the entities. Frankly, who knows? I think certainly that one of the things that I like, one of the ways I imagine this is the notion that it's almost like the spirit, let's just say the spirit, the entity appears, and it kind of scrabbles around inside your brain to find out what material it can use to formulate its shape. And so entities tend to pick things that we are biologically geared up to notice. So vertically symmetrical faces, eyes, forms like sinuous serpent movement or insect-like movement.
A lot of insects.
So it's like it's almost like these spirit beings. Again, we're talking a kind of animist kind of register. These spirit beings arrive or arise through us into our awareness, and they kind of take on the form that is a combination of our preconceptions and expectations, and also our own personal history. And
they kind of have to work with that, because that's the contents of, if they came to something outside your knowledge, it would just be meaningless to you.
Exactly, and that's part of the point of these things. I mean, again, whatever their ontological status, often these entities turn up in order to tell you something that you kind of, sometimes it's a thing that you kind of know, but that you haven't yet kind of brought into conscious awareness. So it's as though the being appears to impart some kind of information, and perhaps it has to appear as an apparently external entity in order for that interaction to happen in that kind of a way. It's like you can think all kinds of things in your own head, but when a mate of yours says something that's really just hits the nail on the head, and you go, oh yeah, I see it, I get it, right, fantastic. And it requires this entity, your mate, who's outside of yourself, even though in a kind of a very big sense they're not really outside of yourself at all. We're all part of this one biological unfolding process, breathing the same atmosphere, blah blah blah. But it needs to be the apparent other that gives the information, and then that allows us to cognize it, to understand it. So I think that's what a lot of what these entities are kind of, that's what they bring through. I mean, certainly people, there are now, particularly with the return of things like psychedelic therapy, there are huge numbers of stories of people going through various kind of psychedelic journeys and the kind of encounters they have with disincarnate, members of their family or other kind of beings or whatever. And the reason that those encounters happen is that there's usually an insight given to the person that appears to arise from that entity that allows them to change whatever it is in their life they're after changing. The addictions they're looped into, or other aspects of their life that are problematic. But it's those encounters with these other beings that makes the change.
Yeah. Do you think there's any sort of physiological or neurological changes? It gets criticised, but I love the Leary 8-circuit model. It makes so much sense to me that you've got imprint vulnerability, and it's random, so you can get something good or something bad. And I think Magick and psychedelics, I always describe Magick as a kind of slow burn psychedelic. Like Terence McKenna said about why sweep outside the ashram when you can enter nirvana with a substance,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I would say that the benefit of having some kind of magical practice or training or learning or whatever you want to call it is that um, it allows a degree of insight into the way that one might navigate these things. So, as a young man, I accidentally took a very high dose of LSD. And it was one of the things that helped me navigate that experience was the fact that I'd already spent before that a good 5 years learning, the Kabbalah in particular.
Oh, absolutely.
And
So you had a framework.
yeah, exactly. It's like you don't, obviously you don't confuse the map with the territory. You don't think that because I know this structure, it's that's all that's necessary. But having that kind of framework, I think is really, really helpful. And there are many different ways of kind of doing this. Some people do it with the language of psychotherapy, transpersonal, Jungian psychotherapy, or alchemy, or whatever. You and I just happen to do it through the language of Magick, particularly perhaps the Western esoteric tradition. So learning that stuff, it's the classic analogy would be it's like Picasso learning to be an exquisitely beautiful
master draftsman at 15.
yeah. You see the early work and you just go, this is absolutely outstanding. And it's that then allows him to break out and to get those other influences with African masks and so on, and to explore different possibilities of representing things on a flat plane, but with aspects. But you kind of, I think, important for him to have perspective and shading and anatomy and measuring and all those things.
Oh yeah.
In order to be able to disregard those things or to mutate them in a way that really, would led to beautiful art.
Yeah, he said it took him 80 years to learn how to paint like a child.
Exactly.
And exactly. I think speaking through my own experience, always after a mushroom ceremony, I feel the next day I'm usually at the place I was at, and it's just like you could throw the stone onto a beach. It's so close to a beautiful wild beach in Speyside, and you get that beautiful. It's almost like a defrag.
Yeah.
It gets. I think really yearly or twice yearly is ideal. You don't have to be.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think that this is, one looks at the kind of difficulties facing our culture, our communities, our species, and I think that having a regular practice of changing awareness and entering this psychedelic state, which doesn't have to be through chemistry, but it is most readily accessible through chemistry for many people, doing that is really helpful. It defrags the hard drive of the mind. It's like the equivalent of kind of coming into your house and just tidying everything up. You feel better, everything's in its place, you know what's going on. And also you have more capacity for whatever comes next. It's not going to stop suffering. That's obviously not going to be the case, but it does mean that you're in a better position to deal with things. And also that you're dealing with things from a place where you're less freaked out, less anxious. And we know that human beings, when they're fearful, they tend to make snap decisions. We kind of have to, here's this animal charging at me. Am I going to fight it or am I going to run away? I have to make a binary decision, a yes or a no. But most of life isn't like that. Most of life is much more complex and much more messy. And in order to stay in a place where you can be curious about the world and you can entertain different options and different possibilities and then explore those, that's probably a better place to be in the complex world like the one in which we find ourselves. So the idea of people going and regularly having some kind of a psychedelic experience, I think that would really help with the way that humans, it would help prevent humans from seeking out the simplistic answer. And the simplistic answer is often, well, it's the problem of the Jews or the Scottish or the black people or the whatever, it's
absolutely,
of course, othering and wrong and blah, blah, blah. So I think that those kinds of experiences that help us sit with uncertainty, open ourselves up to curiosity, allow us to have a bit more kind of workspace to deal with the experiences that we have. Yeah, really helpful. I'd like to see a time in the future where it's just like a normal part of culture. Oh, you going
Yeah.
to the Zendo? You're going to the temple? You're going to whatever? Oh, yeah. No, I
Yeah.
just feel it's about time that I need to go and get like a defrag on the brain. Fantastic, excellent. We'll have a great time. I'll see you next Tuesday. Whatever.
Well, San
And
Francisco have just legalized mushrooms, haven't they?
and there are things, changes happening in the law in Oregon. Oregon is probably, I think, the state that is at the leading edge of this. There are the state of Oregon is pushing through legislation which will allow people to train to be psychedelic sitters. So people who hold space within, let's call it a session, or for other people it will be described more as a ceremony. And those people don't necessarily have to be clinicians, but they do have to go through a licensing process to get the ticket so they can use the medicine. And in the States, it also means that they can get insurance, so they can practice and they can be insured and so on.
Yeah, wow.
Take money for things.
That's a huge stride forward. I mean, there was the legalization of cannabis.
Yeah, it's massive. It's massive. And then, and alongside that is the decriminalized nature movement, which, again, in the States, in particular, in Canada and other places, has been doing really good stuff with saying, people should be allowed to cultivate these substances, these medicines, particularly if they're not doing so for commercial gain, just because.
Absolutely.
We know that.
Well, it's like a natural human right that, when I'm picking mushrooms and some authority figure, a police car slowly drives round, it's really irksome. Like, these are, this is my land, these are my mushrooms. Why should they be? And I think for a while they were Class A. It's just absolutely nonsense.
They still are. They still are. I mean, Britain, unfortunately, has some of the most, I will call it, repressive legislation. We had an act passed in 2016, which was to deal with novel cannabinoids, so things like spice.
Oh yeah, spice. Yeah.
And I saw that piece of legislation go all the way through, and I saw the 4 options that were given to government. They picked the most draconian and the least enforceable. Which was to just basically ban everything. And the problem is, if you ban everything, all you do is you create a massive underground market. Look
Absolutely.
at America during the Prohibition.
Exactly.
It's when the mafia started to exist in its, in the way that we understand it now. So it's not a good strategy. It's not a good strategy at all. And particularly given the fact that these substances, most people are taking them, frankly, so that they feel better and that they are more. That they can be more well, and even
absolutely.
even if you're taking some of this, these materials for recreation, what's recreation? It's recreation. It's like having joy, in one's life. And I think that we have a big sort of post-Protestant anxiety about pleasure and about joy. Or where will it lead? Or that's going to end in tears.
Yeah.
It's like, well. No, not necessarily. Actually, even under Prohibition, huge numbers of people use psychedelics every week in the British Isles. Very, very small number of people have any trouble with it. And that's under the worst possible conditions. So imagine if the conditions were actually good, things would be even easier, I would suggest.
Absolutely. I think you could eat like a pound of psilocybin and not die.
There's no LD50 for mushrooms. You couldn't. I mean, there's no way you get enough in your stomach to kill you, assuming that there is even an upper limit. Obviously, these are powerful substances.
Oh my God, you would be.
But the same is true as your car is an incredibly dangerous weapon. Half a ton of like speeding metal miles an hour.
Yeah.
There's nothing to stop us having licensing, personal cultivation. There are many models, and the US is leading the way, I think, with that. I hope that as the drug war came from the US and was visited on the rest of the planet, that as the US changes, then those other nations will change their laws as well.
Yeah, I would imagine Europe and Britain won't be too far behind. The possibly the last point I wanted to bring up with you. Do you know the work of Dr. Gallimore? Andrew Gallimore.
I do know Andrew. Yeah.
Excellent. So I just got his book, Alien Information Theory. It's very. I mean, I'm not a scientific type dude, and a lot of it is neurochemistry and all that. But am I right in thinking that he's obviously had the experience, but as a scientist, not with all our crazy ideas about spirits and stuff, he breaks through into this other dimension, and there's all these guys staring back at him. And then before he can do anything, he's sucked back out, and nothing was achieved. No communication. I mean, can you imagine the advantages of communicating with whoever these guys are?
Well, there's a sequence of experiments being run at the moment, which rather romantically in a sci-fi way is called DMTX. So
yes, I've heard of
know
it.
about this. So this is like extended DMT. So it's done as an infusion. So you basically you've got a pipe leading into you, into which the DMT is released direct into the bloodstream. And I know people who've been part of this kind of.
Oh, do you? They've actually gone through that experience.
Oh yeah. No, I know.
Wow, man.
A few folks who've kind of done this one. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think that Andrew's ideas, I think, are a really fascinating kind of almost a restatement of something that looks a bit like a kind of this notion of another reality or another kind of parallel existence.
Yes,
which is
there's something out there waiting for us to break through.
I mean, so, see, I have a slightly different view, I think, which is that I have quite a kind of flat cosmology in the sense that I think I think any complex information structure can end up being perceived as a spirit under the right conditions. And what I mean by that is that you can have meaningfully, you can speak about or indeed encounter the spirit of an age, the spirit of a people, the spirit of a particular location. And the thing about DMT is because DMT is so powerful, particularly visually, it gives people a sense of like, I'm definitely seeing this independent being. I think it sometimes overwhelms people so that they forget that actually encounters with spirit beings happen all the time. Loads of people encounter, ghosts, members of their family, all kinds of stuff happens. And that those encounters with spirit beings might be really noticeable in DMT, but actually they're really, really frequent. So whether and particularly if we broaden the idea of spirit to include, egregores or to include cultural sort of entities, these things they're actually all around us. It's more like we're embedded in an ecology which includes spirits than for me that there's like a stargate called DMT to another world. Because we encounter these things all the time, particularly as magicians. Like it's not surprising. The idea of, oh my God, I've just seen a spirit. It's like, well, welcome to scrying, or welcome to invocation, or welcome to, I mean, it's not an uncommon thing. I think DMT is powerful partly because even in people who have not kind of cultivated the imagination or done magical work, you put DMT into them and they will very likely have these kinds of encounters. But again, the encounter is hugely influenced by the environment and so on. So
and expectations, you're kind of told to expect insectoid creatures, Terence McKenna's machine elves. I think what's happening is, I think that's kind of what Andrew's saying as well, that we can, as you were saying earlier on, we only have a set reference. Anything beyond that reference has to come to appear to us in some kind of form with some kind of voice. Our communication is just impossible.
I mean, the example I often use is that this perception of entities is undoubtedly built into our biology, because our biology is geared up to interact with other thinking, self-aware entities, i.e. other human beings. And even things like at the moment, I'm experiencing you saying words to me, and they're coming out of your mouth. They're not. They're coming out of a speaker, which is down at the bottom of the screen that I'm using. But my brain pieces it together and goes, Steve is speaking. That's obviously what's going on. So we're used to we are designed, if you like, or we have evolved to encounter beings. And part of the reason for that, and Ramsey Duke's Lionel Snell talks about this in some of his essays, where he says,
I love Ramsey.
The man's a star, and I got to see him recently because he was at a conference I was at in Northampton, which is really lovely to catch up with the guy. And if you think about this, one of the examples he uses is he says, that we personalize the photocopier or the car or the car. What's wrong with you? Why are you? And the reason we do that is because the biggest bits of our brains are for interpersonal learning and understanding. That's actually the biggest workspace we have. So by giving something else like agency, that is a strategy for interacting with it in a way that gives us meaning. In the same way that I interact with you as though Steve is speaking with me, rather than there is a picture of Steve on the screen, which is actually really little, and there's some sound coming out the speaker. I put it all together and say, well, to have a conversation, I enter into this sense that, you know, I'm just with another thinking separate entity, and I forget the fact that actually it's a, you know, what, 6 inch by 4 inch square, and that's not the point.
It just feels like we're communicating. So predictions for the rest of the century, Julian. A small task there just at the end. You know, we've had excuse my language, but we've had a disastrous start to the 21st century, really. If you look at world politics, you know, are we going to evolve into brain cells of an artificial intelligence? Is everything going to be beautiful? And I'm guessing you're going to say things are going to go pretty much as they have for the last 20,000 years.
I don't know. I mean, you know, we are at this really interesting kind of point. I mean, I was just talking to Anthony Peakin about this idea that, you know, I grew up in the 70s under the shadow of nuclear war.
As did I. We're almost exactly the same age.
Yeah, man. And here we are back in the storyline again. And it's almost like it's kind of. I think that's quite helpful to remember that this actually hasn't gone away. Just because we've not been speaking about it, it doesn't mean that the missiles aren't still in their silos. You know, so that. I think the combination of the fact that we know that there are, you know, huge things that need sorting out in terms of our relationship with, not just with each other, but also with the biosphere. I mean, we're having this conversation as the ice caps melt and as species disappear all the time. So with that kind of nightmare fear of catastrophe, which is absolutely kind of present, on a planet that we now really fully understand is like a very relatively small space in a very, very, very big universe. What do we do with this? You know, how are we going to survive and thrive? Obviously, there's the possibility of huge conflict, you know, huge amounts of suffering and so on. But I think that one of the interesting things about the kind of psychedelic renaissance is that this renewed appreciation for these altered states of awareness, where we reconnect ourselves with aspects of ourselves that are damaged, so we can kind of transcend trauma, that we reconnect with, you know, landscape in the form of foraging our liberty caps or whatever, and that we reconnect with a broader biosphere and with each other. I think that's a really valuable and interesting medicine to be around at this time. You know, there's work going on at the moment with using ayahuasca as a conflict resolution tool with ayahuasca ceremonies with both Palestinians and Israelis.
Wow, they're the first two nations that popped into my head there.
That is genuinely a thing, right? That is genuinely
a
thing. Some of the kind of the research has been done on that and about, you know, these groups and how they're starting, because of course ayahuasca kind of comes into a community and it kind of often crosses a lot of kind of cultural boundaries, and so these people have found themselves in that space and done all the things that you would expect. So there's difficulty, there's tension, but there's also the opportunity to learn each other's songs and to sing these while you're taking this medicine and to have this shared experience, which is about boundary transcending. So, you know, and people often say, oh, you know, when they've taken their first MDMA, they kind of go, oh, you know, well, they're lying there and they're floating. Oh, great if all the world leaders took MDMA. Maybe, you know,
put it in the water supply.
Yeah, well, people joke about this, but it's you know, it's worth trying, isn't it? If you're going to send millions of people, particularly, you know, young people, to their deaths,
I know.
I would want to have some sort of international law that says that whoever's going to do this has to be locked in a room, ideally with some nice music and lighting, with a bunch of advisors
and some incense.
It takes some MDMA and see whether or not it is possible to find some sort of resolution, right? And we think, oh, that will never happen. That's crazy talk. Thousands of years ago, European culture had the rites of Eleusis, which were a psychedelic initiation, which, you know, all the philosophers went to, the emperor would go to, all kinds of people. So it's not out of the question at all. You know, if we think these substances have this possibility for developing empathy, I would like to see that actively used in situations where we have conflict. And the other thing about them, I think, is that what a lot of these psychedelics do, again, whether it's chemically induced or whether it's induced through ceremony or ritual practices or whatever, is they allow us to experience a kind of, it's almost like a death. You know, we're taking
absolutely, yeah.
And those kinds of, you know, those sorts of death-like experiences, or those kind of transformative experiences, when people go through those, they generally speaking, and this goes for near-death experience as well, they generally come out of them with more empathy, less grasping into the world. They have more of a sense of humor about life. Now, those are the people who should be doing the negotiations, not a bunch of scared, frightened cokeheads. Or people who are just like, you know, fried on alcohol, because that's who we currently have, right? So yes, there are problems, yes, there are difficulties, you know, territory, ideology, all these kinds of things. But if you get the crazed cokehead, you know, people to do your negotiation, unsurprisingly, you get these kind of conflicts. And, you know, I use cocaine, not because cocaine is inherently a bad drug, but it is the drug of choice, certainly of the British parliamentarians, you know.
Cocaine and alcohol.
Last year, I mean, the House of Commons was swabbed for cocaine, and I think that basically pretty much all positive.
Wow.
So you have to kind of ask yourself, you know, these substances and these experiences, could they play a role in just setting the stage for more humane negotiations between people, you know?
Absolutely. I mean,
that might be a good thing to do.
It is seeping into the culture so much more now, and with almost all, it seems to me, a lot of 20-somethings are going to these ceremonies and getting turned on to the psychedelics. So they are the future. So maybe we will get a kind of beautiful, archaic revival, 21st century. I'd love to think so.
It's certainly worth. I mean, the thing is, if you're a magician, you understand that the messages that we put out into the universe are spells, and so to at least countenance the possibility that cut to 20 years' time, let alone 100, that we might be in a situation where we have managed to find at least strategies that are better for dealing with our conflicts, and find ways to have more equitable distribution of resource, and find ways to be with the biosphere better, to generate our power more. Like, we could do this. Like, you know, we're at a really interesting point. I was reading something today about some research in Japan, I think it was, to create a film that essentially sits in the glass of your windows that generates electricity from the sun and even from the lights that you've got inside. So, like, technologically we're there. Culturally, we've got all kinds of different resources, including things like kind of psychedelic substances. But we have to be able to at least imagine, if not a utopia, then we have to be able to start to imagine how we might live better together. Because if we can't imagine that, then we end up with the nocebo effect. We end up with this thing where we're continuously telling ourselves like these messages, you know, we're bad, we're wrong, or it's all, you know, it's never going to get any better, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And if you continuously cast a spell on yourself,
of course, yes,
you know, unsurprisingly, that's the result you get, you know.
Yeah, your inner kind of programs you, so you've got to get in there and reorientate that dialogue to the world's not going to end, it's all going to be beautiful.
Certainly to allow for the possibility of it. Certainly to allow for that possibility. You know, when you come away from the psychedelic experience with that bigger capacity, like, shit's still going to go down, bad things still going to happen, but you feel more open, you feel more curious, you feel that you can kind of cope with things more kind of successfully. And in that time and in that space, to be able to imagine those good and positive outcomes, however we frame, you know, what that means to us individually or as a group or whatever, like, that's really, really essential. If we can't imagine a good future, then it's going to be very unlikely we would ever get to one.
Well, I'm conscious of taking your time, Julian, because I know you're very busy. I am shattered after my travails. Thank you so much for coming on again, Julian. You're always so effusive and optimistic, and I can be a old cynic sometimes. So thank you. You've reprogrammed me, man.
Oh, my friend, just think back to the Callanish stone circle. Just think
exactly,
back to
exactly.
that beautiful central stone, which wiggles its way like a Salvador Dali slither of rock.
It really does, yes. Yeah.
I mean, you know, those stones been there for a long time, and you know, we are supported by the depth of our ancestors, and we are supported by that medicine that you found there in the landscape. And you know, let's see if we can conjure for an amazing.
Yeah, absolutely, Julian. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. I'll be asking you back again in a few months because you've always got new stuff on the go. We'll have to talk about Aleister Crowley sometime.
We'll do that. Steve, lovely to speak with you again, my friend.
Thank you so much, Julian. You're goodbye.
Cheerio.
Right, that's broadcast. Thank you, Julian. I love you so much. You're such a nice chap.